Okay, so is there one argument which proves Islam and disproves Christianity? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, we're joined with us with Jay, who is going to be presenting a Christian point of view. Now, I had this discussion with David Wood about 15 years ago. Let me share my screen here real quick. And if you ever get a chance, listen to this debate. It's very good. And in fact, I'll put it inside the description of this particular uh, discussion which we're going to have. So let me just play a couple of seconds of it. Going back to this point, now look, if I am to become a Christian today, how am I supposed to understand? I have to reject the Quran as a book of deception. And I still don't understand how I'm supposed to understand this. The book of deception saved billions upon billions of children from FAS. I already showed you how, by condemning alcohol. As a result, billions of mothers never drank a glass of wine in their life. By doing that, they don't even have to worry about FAS. That's how it saved it. While the book of God allowed alcohol in moderation. So my question is, well, how did the book of deception do this while God's
time's
book...
up.
Yeah.
If you're talking about wonderful things that the Quran has done, and it saved people from fetal alcohol syndrome, think about other things Muhammad did.
So he goes on he goes on to say, okay, well, let me show you, there's some good things in religion. Let me show you some other things. He really was never able to answer that. It's been 15 years now, and I've been chasing him to, let's finish the discussion, and he has been running away from the scientific evidence of the Quran. Now, is this really one argument from science that disproves Christianity and proves Islam? That's what we're going to discuss today with Jay here, and we're going to have a very interesting discussion here. So let me just kind of give you some background. What are we talking about? What are the positions of the two books? And then we'll begin the discussion. So basically, inside the Bible, it allows a certain moderate amount of alcohol. For example, in John chapter 2, verse 7 through 11, it says over, Jesus basically turned water to wine. He asked everyone bring out the choicest wine first, and the cheaper wine, and then the cheaper wine after the guests had too much to drink. But then you save the best till last. And so they had so much to drink that, then Jesus basically gives them all this wine. Now, there are verses in the Bible which condemns drunkenness, but this obviously challenges those other verses. So it's confusing. And so the Quran comes 600 years later, and at first, drinking was tolerated. People used to drink alcohol, but then verses came in a gradual sense, and then finally it was made prohibited. Inside chapter 5, verse 90 of the Quran, it says, "O ye have believed, intoxicants and gamblings are but the defilements from Satan, so avoid it." We also read inside the Hadith, it talked about how some people used to drink alcoholic beverages. The early Muslims used to do that during the early days of the Battle of Uhud. And on the same day, they were killed as martyrs. And that was before wine was prohibited. So it was, and you'll find many scholarly articles which document this, the Islamic position. It says, this is just a research paper I'm presenting in front of you, which talks about this. It says, before the teachings of Muhammad, drinking was common. Then gradually the Quran would first give some advice. It's better not to come to the prayer drunk, and then finally it would condemn it. This is a fact which has been taught in history books and in books all across the country. And this is just an example of a school book, textbook, which documents this fact. So there was research done. Let me kind of give you some what this research is, and we'll jump into the discussion here. So there was a research done on fetal alcohol syndrome in which they discovered that there was a relationship between Islam and Christianity and fetal alcohol syndrome. What they discovered was because Islam condemned alcohol, and not only that, but it was able to implement this condemnation, which is very interesting. Muslims are 50 times less likely than the global average to have a fetal alcohol baby. The research paper from continues. It says, in contrast, wine is a part of communion in the Catholic faith, and abstinence is much less common among Catholic. So the paper goes on saying you got to look at the Christians. If you're looking at the Muslims, you're going to be wasting your time. And in a separate study, that's exactly the determination they made. They just decided, if you're Muslim, forget it. We don't even want to include you into the study because it was so difficult to find a fetal alcohol child among them. So the research says, who were excluded from the study, Muslim, observant Muslim women whose practices prohibit alcohol consumption. So this is a great compliment. And we see here that Islam has saved millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome. Now, in the following article, Focus on the Family, this is a Christian article. Here it documents many examples of what we see in the research paper of Christian mothers suffering because they might have had some alcohol in moderation. They might have drank a little bit. And so this is the way this article, which I'm presenting in front of you, is how they're coping with that. So that's a brief synopsis of it. So we're going to have a discussion on this topic. And so we're going to just kind of go 1 minute back and forth. And so I'll tell you, so the first question I wanted to ask Jay here is the issue of divine negligence. Alcohol, in fact, let me start my 1 minute, sorry. Alcohol is a drug. We know, science today tells us that alcohol is a drug. Science today tells us that you have to give a warning on this before you administer this drug. It's just not for everybody. For example, you got to warn children, you got to warn pregnant women. The Bible administered a drug, but there's no warning. And as a result, we can see from the studies, the Christian women have suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. So the question here, and I know maybe you may not be convinced, no, the Bible doesn't need to have a warning. It does. And I'll give you 3 reasons. Number 1, because science said so. Number 2, the Bible does say so. And I'll show you later on, the Bible does actually say you have to warn women about this. And number 3, because how do you explain the false prophet Muhammad, if we are to assume that, and we'll get into Islam later, after we discuss Christianity, saved all these children while Christianity let them perish? Go ahead.
Yeah, certainly. So definitely a couple of things that definitely need to be noted. I would say the first thing, and certainly the most important thing in my personal opinion, is I think we need to understand that the idea of absolutely requiring some sort of a Surgeon General's warning, for lack of a better term, I don't think that that's a requirement at all. First and foremost, science does not tell us what we must and mustn't do when it comes to giving out drugs. Those are things which you are told you can or cannot do are actually moral things. They are not scientific things. So when you say to somebody, you need to, for example, put a Surgeon General's warning on a box of cigarettes, science doesn't care if there's a Surgeon General's warning on a box of cigarettes. Science doesn't care one way or the other. But morality tells us a lot of times that if we want to sell this product to someone, then maybe we might want to tell them about some of the negative side effects of this product. So that's one thing I would want to point out. Firstly, the second thing I would like to point out.
Let me go respond to that real quick. I'm going to make a very quick discussion back and forth. Okay, well, let me correct you. Science does say for all drugs. In fact, for example, if for women who take drugs during pregnancy, there's specific labels that if this is something dangerous for a pregnant woman, it's specifically written on there. Do not take this drug because this could affect the pregnancy. But not only that, but we also see in medieval times, Christian children began drinking beer at age 5. So the problem is the Bible did make a drug available to the general public, but it didn't have a warning label on it. It didn't tell them, hey, wait a second, this is not for everybody. And so that's the mistake, and that's the error of science. So, on every alcohol bottle, there is a warning label there. And so that's a question, why don't we find a warning label on this drug which the Bible administered? Go ahead.
Well, there's a couple things with that. The first thing, and I do want to stress this, there's no scientific law which says that that's a requirement. That is something that human beings, specifically human beings in the West, and then later on across the world, have decided to do. Right. But there is no scientific law. Like, for example, there's Newtonian laws of physics, right, which dictate speeds of gravity and so on and so forth. Right. Those are scientific laws. Science tells us just how fast something will fall once it hits terminal velocity if we're on the planet Earth. But science has no such law that says you must give such and such a Surgeon General's warning or whatever it happens to be, right, about drugs. That is just something that we have decided because we believe that it was morally just to do so. Now, I would quickly point out two separate things when it comes to this idea of warnings. The first thing is that the Bible is very clear that it does not want people taking this stuff either in extreme amounts or in ways that would make one drunk, right? That is certainly something that would count as a warning. In
Okay,
fact, there
thanks.
is in Proverbs.
Let me respond to that real quick. So first of all, let me correct you. It is a law actually that if this drug or this alcohol is going to harm the fetus, you have to warn. And that is just this divine. So what we're talking about, I don't see a good reason from you for this divine negligence, which has, as I showed you from the article, Christian women are now suffering because there was no warning. Now, let me show you the warning. There is a warning. I'll even show you the Bible says you have to warn people. This is in the book of Judges, chapter 13. It says it talked about, okay, you are going to have a boy. Let me read it real quickly. Then a man of God came to me. He looked like an angel of God. I didn't ask him where he came from. But let me keep reading quickly. You will become pregnant and have a son. Now then, drink no wine, nor fermented drink, nor do not eat any other unclean something or another. So there was a warning, but the warning failed. There are several reasons why that warning failed. So when I come back, I'll explain why this warning failed. But go ahead, please.
Well, again, I would challenge you to find me the scientific law, right? A law that cannot be determined by human beings, right? That we have no subjective ability to take away or add to, right? I would like to see that scientific law, which requires somebody to give some sort of a rundown of the different side effects of a certain substance, because again, that is something that we as human beings have decided we are going to do. There is no Newtonian laws of physics that can be easily measured, which prove definitively that that is something you have to do. Furthermore, I would point out, like I said, that the Bible is very clear. Drunkenness is to be condemned. In fact, it says drunkards won't even enter the kingdom of heaven. In Proverbs, it says, who has sorrow without cause? Those who tarry long at the wine, right? So it is very clear in forbidding drunkenness. It doesn't forbid alcohol in its entirety, but of course, forbidding alcohol in its entirety would not actually make any sense for numerous reasons. We know, for example, that people needed to purify their drinks in certain areas of the world because they were not able to drink clean water.
Yeah, so, the issue of drunkenness is a non-issue because even a moderate amount of alcohol can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. Also, that's where the contradiction sort of comes in. Jesus, in the passage which I showed you in the Bible, it said that they drank so much that they couldn't even drink anymore. So again, look what I'm showing you, how the Bible is creating this confusion. You are right, there are verses which say, okay, don't get drunk. But there's also verses that said that Jesus gave them so much wine they couldn't drink anymore. So how do you reconcile that? So let's talk about why the biblical warning failed. Number one, it only warned the sons. What about the daughters? And it gave the wrong reason. Why a pregnant woman shouldn't drink is not because the boy will be a Nazirite of God from the womb. No, that's not the reason why. Number three, the warning was not made absolutely mandatory without exception. So there's no emphasis. So as a result, 2,000 years went by and the Christians were not warned, nor were the Jews. So anyways, so we do see a warning, Jay. Now explain to me, when you say that there shouldn't be a warning, you're refuting your own Bible. Now please explain that.
Well, that's certainly not the case, because for one, this particular verse is referring to the woman who is going to be birthing. I believe this is the story of Samson, if I'm not mistaken. And as a result, what the angel rather is actually commanding this woman is in particular in regards to the fact that her child is going to be a Nazirite, not necessarily anything to do with the alcohol itself. Furthermore, I would just point out that those other areas of the Bible where it strictly condemns drunkenness are certainly not irrelevant. If we were to return to that John chapter, one thing that we cannot find in the book of John anywhere, whether it's that passage or elsewhere, is somewhere where Jesus explicitly endorses the people getting drunk just because people did get drunk. In other words, there's something that Kent Hovind very often says, which I think is definitely very true. It is true that they said that, but what they did may not have been true or just or right or what have you, right? And that is something that you certainly see all over the Bible. It is
Okay,
very clear elsewhere that
thanks.
drunkenness is condemned, that use
Okay,
of alcohol
yeah, Jay.
is.
Jay, here's the thing. I understand the context that this is talking gave a different reason for this, but the Bible is wrong. Okay, this is an example of how the Bible has been changed. A pregnant woman should not drink alcohol because it can hurt the fetus. That was a right reason. So here we see the Bible attempted to warn people. So for you to come and say, "Oh, there's no need for," so all the drug companies and all the alcohol companies, it is mandatory by law for them to warn people that, hey, this drug might hurt the fetus or it can hurt children or something like that. I want to, okay, so that's what we had. That's what science today, and you are wrong when you say it is not something in law. If a company administered a drug that they knew could hurt women or pregnant women, it's not only would be a multi-million lawsuit, it would be a criminal action. Okay, so I want to know from you, why isn't there, I want to explain this divine negligence. Why did the Bible administer a drug without warning for pregnant women?
See, and again, there's just these things that we need to acknowledge. For example, you keep saying that this is a law. I'm not talking about a legal law. I'm not talking about something that the legislature got together and passed. I'm talking about a scientific law. For example, to give you an example of a scientific law, right? This bag of chips will fall, right? Because gravity is a scientific law. It doesn't matter if the Parliament of the United Kingdom decides to pass a law condemning gravity. Gravity is still a law, right? That's just the way it will be always and forever. Where is the scientific law which requires people to give certain warnings about certain products? And by the way, if you do find such a law, which you can't because it doesn't exist, but if you do find such a law, I assure you it will destroy absolutely every single text written before the last 100 years, because none of them, absolutely none of them, had an explicit and completely comprehensive list of the drugs that their people were using, right? Literally none of them, let alone talking about all of the different side effects of those drugs. To
Okay,
give a perfect
thanks,
example,
Jay.
coffee.
All right, so I understand there's no written law here, but you're not answering the question. Do you not see all the people who have been hurt by this? I'm sharing with you an article here. It says, it's talking about a Christian, how she's coping with having a fetal alcohol baby. So my point here is, God would have known this. He would have known this. And my question to you, and it'll be the final time I will ask you this question here. And now we see why David Wood and all the Christian apologists and scholars have ran away. They are not able to answer this question either. And so I'm very grateful that at least you are coming forward to discuss this. So this is the final time here, final time I'm going to ask you, Jay, how do you explain, forget about the man-made laws and all that, and laws of physics and all that, how do you explain that a all-knowing God administered a drug to the public, knowing the potential harm to the fetus and to children? How do you explain him not issuing a warning?
It's simple. He doesn't have to issue explicit warnings about every individual thing, right? He already has issued certain warnings saying that those who tarry long with the wine have sorrow without cause, saying that drunkenness is condemned, so on and so forth. And it's in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament. I believe there's even a portion where Jesus talks about it in the book of Matthew, though I could be mistaken that with one of Paul's wordings, so I'm not going to actually quote it. But it's very clear, right? Drunkenness all over the scripture is certainly blatantly, strongly condemned. In fact, one of the things we know here in the United States is evangelicals, otherwise known as fundamentalists, very often are completely abstinent from alcohol. And in fact, there are even Christian scholars who argue saying that that's too strict, which is neither here nor there. The point being that they obviously, being the strict, devout fundamentalist types, have seen this as a complete and total prohibition of alcohol numerous times. So the requirement here to say, well, if you're a pregnant woman, you can't do such and such a thing. And if you're under the age of such and such an age, you can't do such and such a thing. That's just
Okay,
not
thanks.
a requirement God has.
Okay. So, I think that was, I think we've talked all that we possibly could on, Christianity. So let us show for the record, he doesn't really have an explanation for why would there be a divine negligence. My point here, it's so painfully obvious that these are the words of man, not a words of God. The Bible tried to, but it failed to warn people, especially pregnant women and children. This is how science contradicts the Bible and disproves the Bible. Now, the question which I want to raise right now, let's turn the page and let's turn to Islam. Do you see any kind of divine negligence on this topic of fetal alcohol syndrome, Jay? So why don't you go and take the rest of the time and tell me if you have any issues related to Islam on this issue.
Certainly. I actually have multiple. I will list them out as fast as I possibly can because I want to make sure we stay within time.
Sure.
First thing, without addressing any of the individual passages, it must be made clear that the Quran is very explicit in its affirmation of both the Torah and the Gospel. This is found in the Gospel and therefore is explicitly affirmed by the Quran. The second thing I would like to point out here is that the Quran itself does not meet the strict qualifications which Nadir is meeting. For example, it is known that Arab people for long periods of time now have used coffee. Hookah is incredibly popular in the Middle East, and yet we don't see any such warnings about these things in the words of the Quran. The third thing I would like to point out, and this is easily the most important thing, is that the Quran is not nearly as clear on this issue as Islamic apologists would like you to believe. Here's the strictest single verse against alcohol in the Quran. It is, "O you who believe," this is Surah 590, by the way.
Okay,
"O
thanks,
you
Jay.
who believe."
Thanks. That's for 1 minute. So let me just address your concerns here. The issue about let me start my time here. That the Quran is not that confirms the Torah and the Gospel. This is kind of off topic. I did debate this, and if you like, we can discuss this at a later time. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It confirms exactly what we found today, that the Bible was changed by man. The story about Jesus turning water to wine, and they had so much wine that they couldn't drink anymore, which contradicts all the passages you're raising about don't get drunk. That is clearly a man-made addition to the Bible, because knowing God would know that. He would know the suffering that this is going to cause people, and God is not. He is here to help the people, not bring them suffering and misery. So now the other point which you raised about coffee. Well, on the wine bottle, there's no warning for coffee there either. You know why? Because the warning, or opium or marijuana, because those wine bottles and the drugs don't prescribe that. That's why there's no warning. And that's why there's no warning in the Quran, because the Quran is not prescribing these things, so it doesn't need a warning. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about something like a prescription, obviously that's not what we saw in the book of John either. There is one passage you could certainly say is somewhat of a prescription when Paul talks about a little bit of wine for your stomach. And in that passage, you could certainly claim that that is a prescription. There's things to be said to that, so I guess I'll wait to see if that's something that you'd like to discuss. But furthermore, I would just like to point out, Allah would certainly know these things are going to be used in mass in his culture. And in fact, coffee would have been used in mass at that time even, because the Ethiopians discovered coffee sometime around 1000 BC. It spread it all over the Arab world by the time of 680, right? And yet we don't see any such warnings. Now, I would like to point out, I don't think that that's a problem. I don't think that even if it turns out that coffee is the most horrible thing for your liver on the entire planet and so on and so forth, I don't care that Muhammad didn't say anything about it, because I don't think he was required to. I am just simply saying, if we're going to use this same logic of, well, this was being used a lot during this time and you didn't seem to condemn it, why is that? Well, that certainly would be a perfect example of divine negligence as well. In fact, we do know coffee can destroy your liver. I mean, the likes of which, I say that while I'm drinking coffee,
Okay,
but
thanks.
just like
Okay,
aspirin
Jay,
and
thanks.
alcohol.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Jay. Not Jay, David Wood, in which he's been running for 15 years now. He does not want to talk about it with me ever again. So I'll ask you the same question. We saw from the statistics, or from the studies, Muslim women are 50 times less likely to have a fetal alcohol baby. Okay, let me get that in front of you here. We see that it was even pointless to study fetal alcohol syndrome in the Muslim women and they were excluded from the study. So the question which I have for you is, how do you explain, if we are to assume that Muhammad is a false prophet, This false prophet saved all of these millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome. And you say, okay, maybe the Quran's not clear on that. Let's assume that's correct. We can measure that. We can quantify that. We know that the clarity is at least at a level of 50 times lower than the global average. We know that it is pointless to next independent study showed that we don't even want to study the Muslim women. So how do you explain that the false prophet saved all these children from fetal alcohol syndrome while the Lord and Savior let them perish, causing lifelong misery and suffering? How do you explain that?
Excuse me. Yeah, definitely. Once again, relatively simple explanation, in my own opinion, at least. The first thing I would say in regards to how is it that a false prophet could possibly do this much good? There's an old saying, dead clock is right twice a day kind of thing, right? And of course, I'm not claiming Muhammad is necessarily a dead clock. He's a human being. He can certainly rationalize and use logic and things like that. But just because you got something right does not necessarily mean that you got everything else right as well. In fact, there's going to be many people, and just to give a perfect example, I think we would agree that a lot of the central tenets of Buddhism, for example, that you should be kind and peaceful to innocent people as well as innocent animals and so on and so forth, I think that we would agree that that's accurate, and it's probably saved a lot of people from unnecessary bloodshed and war. That does not make the Buddha a prophet, though. It absolutely does not make the Buddha a prophet, nor does it make it true that Muhammad is not a prophet simply because there's some people who might interpret his words as a inclination towards jihad. Now, I'm not here to explain jihad or anything like that. My only point is you certainly would not agree that Muhammad is a false prophet because some people took his words to fight others, and Buddha is a correct prophet because his words are clearly nice and peaceful, right? So in other words, just because you're correct once does not actually mean that you are a prophet. Now, to move on to Jesus, because that's obviously kind of a different question. How is it that the correct one could be wrong? There's nothing here that Jesus has said that would be incorrect. So in other words, if you were to say that the phrase "you can use a moderate amount of alcohol" is incorrect, I think that can be very well proven to be inaccurate.
Okay,
In fact, in our
thanks.
previous
Okay,
conversations,
thanks, Jay.
go ahead.
So actually, that is incorrect, and it's if God knew that this was going to harm people, He would not have administered alcohol. The Bible said so. The Bible does issue a warning for the pregnant women from alcohol, but it got mired in confusion and changes. People, the wrong reason was given. So even the Bible goes against you, Jay. And you're saying, well, the real reason why the Bible warned women was for some other reason. No, the real reason was for fetal alcohol syndrome, but those verses got changed and altered to obscure that warning. But I understand all religions teach good, but this is not the question which I'm asking you. The question which I'm asking you is, God knew that Islam was going to come 1400 years later and save all these children from fetal alcohol syndrome. Why didn't God do the same thing? The Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, why didn't He do the same thing as a false prophet Muhammad did? That's my question for you. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and that's like I'm saying here. Just because Muhammad might have done something correct does not mean anything about his religion itself. Likewise, just because and of course I'm gonna explain a little bit deeper because I don't believe Jesus was incorrect, but I do believe prophets, namely people like Paul and Moses and so on and so forth, can be incorrect. The Bible is usually pretty clear when they are correct because God comes into the scripture and corrects them. So in other words, being correct one time or incorrect one time does not prove or disprove you being a prophet, unless of course it's in regards to your prophetic words or something you're speaking from God. So just to get that little rule out of the way. Now, you ask, well, why would Jesus not do the same? Well, because quite frankly, a strict condemnation of alcohol would be disastrous, especially for the people at that time. Just as a perfect example, and I've used this example before, me and you are fully aware, living in the 21st century, that NyQuil is one of the best combatants against the common cold and influenza in the entire world right now. And it, of course, includes alcohol. Benadryl obviously can include alcohol in numerous instances.
Okay.
And
okay, Jay, let me, you made a claim that a condemnation of alcohol would create some kind of humanitarian catastrophe. It would cause a disaster. And you try to show some medicinal value for that. But, Jay, on my YouTube channel, and as you've seen, I've shared my desktop, I bring references for every claim I make. Do you have any reference that alcohol is needed, or else it would have created a humanitarian catastrophe? Do you have any reference for that?
So as far as a
Just
reference, as far
take
as like
10
what
seconds.
somebody else has written,
Take 10 seconds of my time and just answer yes or no.
well, I can't just answer yes or no. I can take a small 10 seconds, but I can't just answer yes or no. And here's the reason. As
Okay.
far as a actual passage written by a doctor right now, I do not have that with me at the moment. Although to be fair, you can go on some of my previous videos and I have discussed, there's evidence to suggest alcohol can strengthen, in small amounts, of course, can strengthen your heart and brain and so on and so forth. I can pull those up if you like, because they're on my previous videos, so I know
Well,
where to
sure,
find
there's
them.
some good in it, but to say that you absolutely have to have alcohol or else it'll create a humanitarian disaster. Well, let's do
Well,
this,
so let me
Jay.
ask you questions, okay?
Yeah.
And I respect where you're coming
Mhm.
from here, okay? So
Mhm.
let's see if we can find a reason why this would be something that we can agree is true. So would you, if you had a severe cold, take something like NyQuil?
Yes.
Okay. So that has alcohol in it. Now I know,
Yes.
because you've said this before, right? And I understand this. You've said
Mhm.
before, well, if it's something that is going to help your life, right, then that is something that Islam permits. Completely agree. Therefore, it is not a strict condemnation of alcohol, though, because if it can be
Mhm.
used in some instances,
Yes.
right, and that is precisely what you find in the scripture. Every single time that alcohol is actually explicitly said, hey, use this, like, for example, when Paul says a little wine for your stomach, he's specifically saying small amounts for medicinal purposes. Now, of
Mhm.
course, the story of Jesus is a little bit of an outlier in that particular sense because Jesus is performing a miracle, not
Well,
necessarily.
that's a scientific error, because when you say a little bit of alcohol for your stomach, you got pregnant women, you got children who is in that group that you're making available to the public. They're part of that public. So no, that is a scientific catastrophe. That's why the study said you had to go to the Christians to study fetal alcohol syndrome. So what you're just digging yourself deeper into a hole. But I think we're pretty much all out of time on this. I think I'm going to ask you one last question. I think you should be prepared for it, because I asked it for you last time. And okay, so you said that Islam has this one good point, or it does teach some good, like all religions teach good. Then let me ask you, from a scientific point of view, we can say, okay, Islam saved millions of children from fetal alcohol syndrome. Not only that, but also look at all the communities of people, of American Indians and others than them, who cannot even handle a little bit of alcohol. And now they're lying drunk on reservations and their lives destroyed. So it's not just fetal alcohol syndrome. It's not just, look at the Aborigines and other than them and the Eskimo communities whose lives have been devastated. But Islam, we don't find reservations of drunkards in our countries. We don't find children drinking beer at age 5. So my question I have for you, show me from the New Testament something which can at least compete with what I'm presenting to you today. Show me from a scientific point of view how the New Testament has saved people in this way. Go ahead.
Yeah, so two things. The first thing I do want to briefly say, just to reiterate what my position here in this is. If the Quran is saying that it is okay to use alcohol in a situation for preservation of your life or health, that is not a strict condemnation. It is equal to what we see in Paul's own writings and the other places we see in the Bible. And if the Quran does not also include, well, asterisk for Native Americans and pregnant women and so on and so forth, then it's guilty of the self-same thing that you are actually levying against Paul right now. Now, if we're going to agree, which I think we should, that Muhammad and Paul were not required to list out absolutely every single thing that might possibly, or whoever it is that wrote the hadith, because I imagine Muhammad himself probably didn't write the hadith you speak of. But nonetheless, right, I think we should be able to agree that that's not something, because if it is, it takes down both of our religions at that point. Now, to move on to your actual question, I would point out numerous things just to kind of be brief and a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, if alcohol helps soothe your stomach, then that is a medicinal quality. But to get a little bit more explicit, and something that I think you can definitely grasp more, the Bible is very clear in its condemnation of certain sexual acts. And we know for a
Okay,
fact in
thanks.
the
Just
21st
1 minute.
century,
Okay,
the 20th
thanks.
century.
Okay, yeah. So a lot of religions condemn, sexual immorality. Sure, we'll find that in many religions. But I want something unique, which we can look at the New Testament, and something that can compete at the level of what I have shared for you. Because according to you, this false prophet, and do you believe Muhammad is from the devil? Do you believe that, Jay?
Well, I don't want to be rude, but I
Okay.
certainly do believe he's a false prophet. Yes.
Okay. Well, Okay, so this false prophet saved all these millions of children, as well as Eskimos and American Indians, if they were to follow Islam, save them from the horrible tragedies. And the tragedies of alcohol and the lifelong suffering just doesn't end with fetal alcohol syndrome. But what from the New Testament? Of course, all religions have some good in it, like don't be rude to your parents and things like that. But I'm going to ask you a final last time. From a scientific point of view, can you show us anything from your Bible which can compete at this level? Because saying, okay, well, don't have premarital sex, that does not compare with what I'm sharing with you. Go ahead.
So I would highly disagree. I would say it absolutely does compare, and there's a couple reasons. So I think the first thing, the qualifier of uniqueness, I think would completely destroy this entire conversation, because the Quran is not the only book, nor even the first book, to strictly condemn alcohol use. But moving on, even besides that, right? We know from modern science that being promiscuous, that premarital sex, that group sex, that homosexuality, so on and so forth, that these things which are strictly condemned in the Bible lead to horrible situations. Now, I have here some statistics strictly from the United States. There are more than 115,000 syphilis cases in 2019 alone. There was 580,000 gonorrhea cases in 2019, alone. There was 1.7 million chlamydia cases in the United States alone in 2019 alone, right?
Yeah.
So if we were to listen to the scriptures on this, we would see that those numbers would dwindle to absolutely zero. Of course, if
Okay, thanks. I
nobody
think that's
follows
our
everything
time.
perfectly, we
Okay,
understand,
so
right?
we'll just wrap up over there. I guess you've heard both perspectives as far as what the scientific evidence for the Bible that can compete, at least with a false prophet, if Muhammad is a false prophet, and that is premarital sex and all the diseases that are caused by it. Okay, I did ask that question to David Wood in the debate. If you get a chance, please listen to it. It will be inside the description of this video. Jay, as always, it's been fun and very informative, I think. And so we'll just let the audience decide. And thank you very much. I'll go and end it right here.